Hello again, everyone. If you have joined us in the last 30 seconds, welcome to track 2 of Summer Community Days. If you've been here, you know me, you know my face. I am bringing Dylan Hughes to the stage right now. He is a senior software engineer at Prefect, and he's going to be doing his talk, No Lead Left Behind. He's also based in DC, which is an important thing to note since we're all remote. If you haven't already, let us know where you're coming in from in the chat. As I've said a couple times on this track, you can jump between the different tracks that are happening today and our topics in the upper left, find breakouts and lounge, and a way to join the community on the nav bar up top. And if you want to interact with us, go ahead and post in the chat. I'll be in there once I give the mic over to Dylan. And if you have any questions for him, drop those in Q&A and we will talk through them at the end. But yeah, with that, Dylan, I'll turn it over to you and I will see everybody shortly.
Thank you very much. Hey, everybody. My name is Dylan, and I'm going to be talking about a recent project we completed here at Prefect, where we improved the way that leads move through our various systems. I hope you'll find this interesting, or at least interesting and hopefully helpful. So what are we going to talk about? So first, we'll just go over a little bit more about who I am. We'll talk a little bit about the problem as it was outlined to me, sort of the system at the start, the plan, challenges that we faced in our end results, and we'll have some time at the end for questions. So the most important thing to know about me for this talk is that in my role at Prefect, I'm essentially responsible for anything that we build that isn't our product. So think about things like the data warehouse, all of our data pipelines, internal applications, etc. I've got a unique and fun view on Prefect. I was the second full-time employee, and I was actually brought on to build the UI. So I've been here for 3 years from our seed rounds. And so I actually wrote the first line of code building the data warehouse, and we sort of built it up to what it is today. And now that we're like Series B and we just hit 90 people, things are very different, but it's been a fun ride. So let's talk about leads. Essentially, there's different ways to think about leads in your system, but basically a lead represents a combination of a person and an event in time that we believe indicates someone may be a candidate for a sales conversation. Classically, leads are often thought of as a funnel, where you start with, potential people, you convince them to use your product, you sell it. But Prefect is a little bit different because we're an open core product. So we have an open source Python package that you can use, and our entire orchestration and everything is open source. And then we sell a managed version of that product for our SaaS platform. So if you're coming into our community, it means that you could be coming in for a number of different reasons. You may be a totally open source user who's joined us in Slack that has no intention of ever using a paid product. You might be on one of our free or our self-serve tiers that doesn't feel like they need to talk to our enterprise team, or you may have done a evaluation of Prefect privately and then are reaching out to our sales team because you want to start an enterprise engagement, or you may have heard about Prefect from one of our various marketing outlooks, and you're trying to start like an enterprise POC right away because you're excited. So, but what this means is that when we use various methods of creating leads in our system, the person may not actually be ready to talk to us yet. So they might want to sit in the free tier, like I said, they might want to stay in the open source. And then but over time, other things may happen in the world, like maybe we send an email marketing campaign and somebody clicks on it, or they join us, in different Slack channels, or they engage with us in a certain way. And those events lead us to believe that maybe now this person is ready to talk to us. And so this sort of thinking about generating leads in your business is called the product-led growth, flywheel, which is the GIF that's playing on the right. Whereas instead of a funnel where people come in and they immediately come to your product, they sort of go through this cycle over and over again where they might advocate for different parts of your product or different aspects of your service. So our problem was that we had a little bit of a black hole in terms of how we were handling our leads after the initial interaction. So in the original process, a lead would be created, we'd evaluate it, and if the person on the other end was ready to talk to us, we'd begin a sales evaluation and everything was great. However, if they didn't respond or they weren't quite ready, our system didn't really have a good way to revive a lead at a later time when the person may be willing to hear what our sales team has to say, hence the black hole. So to understand why this was the case, we need to understand a little bit more about our system and our philosophy around internal tools more generally. So just note here, Prefect's a Series B company. As such, we're not really in a state to have a big internal tools team that manages a bunch of custom applications to accomplish different things. And in a world where, SaaS and the cloud are now very secure, it doesn't really make sense to build a ton of things on your own anyway. But this does lead to some side effects, and namely that a bunch of different teams rely on a bunch of different tools, and we need those tools to talk to each other to accomplish different things. Spaghetti. So for some background, here's how we think about internal tooling at Prefect. So essentially, the way that we think about things is a tool is made up of three things. You have an interface, and you have logic, and you have state. An interface can be a UI, a CLI, a report that shows up in a Slack channel, whatever it is. Logic is, the business decisions made based on the various changes in the state, and the state is, the state of the world as it is, right? This lead is in a new state versus this lead is in a rejected state, for example. And so we have a couple of other principles here that I can walk through really quickly, but it's basically we want our state to live where our interfaces live. We want other people to manage our infrastructure whenever possible, because our infra team is very busy managing all of the infrastructure for our product. And so keeping the load off of them is an important thing for us to do. We want all of our data to go into the data warehouse. So even for all of these tools that we're using as SaaS tools, we want to collect all of the data that we can to get into our warehouse so that we can analyze it and that we can use tools like Census to send it back out into our operational tools and we can act on it. We build custom interfaces using Retool. Basically, Retool is a really great low-code tool that I've been using for a while now, where you sort of drag and drop components and you can build queries, and you can have a shared query library, and it's easy to permission stuff. And it means that we don't have to build our own UIs. So we've sort of taken care of that problem. And this last rule, and this may be the most important one to kind of keep your eye on, which is changes in the state of one tool can cause changes in the state of another tool only via prefect flows. So what does this mean? So we have, you may be aware, but a lot of different tools that you might be using in your SaaS stack have integrations with other tools. So an example of this is like Orbit, which is our community management tool, has integration with let's say Salesforce, right? We could use the Salesforce integration for Orbit to make state changes in Salesforce, but we don't actually want to do that. If it saves us sort of like an ETL trip, that's fine, we can use it, but we don't want there to be logic changing state based on this integration. We want to do that through prefect flows because we want standardization on how it happens. We have a standard way that we write our flows, and we hold ourselves to certain standards, and we have PR reviews and et cetera. And we want to eat our own lunch. One of the cool things about being internal tools at a place like Prefect is that I write a ton of prefect flows, and I get to give our product team a ton of feedback that they find really valuable. And because of that, we build a better product. And so we want to make an effort to use our own tools whenever we can. So having said all of that, let's talk a little bit about the plan that we had. So in order to solve this problem that we had, which is the black hole, right? The proposed plan that we had was to have the growth team take over rejected leads and use content and email marketing campaigns to try and understand when it was a good time for the leads to be revived. This would hopefully lead to a process where leads could be revived and rejected many times without ever being abandoned, hence no lead left behind. And so here is the sort of just a quick diagram of the related systems in the sort of before state. On the left, you have systems that generate lead sources, so our products, our website, marketing landing pages that we might have. In the middle, we have SalesLand, the tools that the sales team uses. Sales teams are pretty notorious for getting hives if they ever leave Salesforce. And on the right, we have the domain of our marketing team, which is customer.io, and they use some other tools that they're not really related to this talk, so I didn't include them. So here was the way that we wanted to lay out the new flow of leads. So an event in the world occurs, the lead gets created in Salesforce, an AE reaches out, and instead of just, and then if the person doesn't respond or says they're not ready to talk to us, we reject the lead. But instead of that just leading to a black hole, we then take their email address. That's not very well labeled, but essentially what I mean is we take the email address of that person in the lead and we push it to the email marketing tool, the customer.io, where our marketing team is responsible for creating campaigns and seeing whether or not the person responds and what kind of content they're responding to, and using that tool to sort of track the success of their efforts there, because it's built to their needs, whereas Salesforce is built to the needs of the sales team, and everyone hates Pardot. So eventually, let's say that a person responds in such a way that we believe that they're ready to talk to us now, we change the state of the lead in Salesforce to revived, and the AE that was originally responsible for that lead or a different AE reaches out. Just want to make sure I don't have any questions. All right. So this was the design of the new system. So the left and the middle look the same. On our left, you have our lead sources, you have SalesLand, and then in the middle, we interject this layer controlled by the internal tools team, where we have two primary services. The first, I think everyone will probably be familiar with, is BigQuery. That's the underlying OLAP database for our data warehouse. And above there, there's a service called the Sensomatic. At Prefect, we're very big on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The sub-ether Sensomatic is the tool that Ford uses to determine whether or not there's a spaceship in orbit and like where he can hitch a ride from. So that's the name I gave our generalized analytics service. So basically, this is just a really simple Python web server that runs in Google Cloud Run, and it just takes generalized events of any kind. So they can have some characteristics like a type and a payload that's just a JSON blob, so we can use it for basically whatever we want. And on the right, we have customer.io again. So the new plan was essentially to say, we use a Prefect flow to pull all our information out of Salesforce into BigQuery. And then based on some conditions, we push information from there into customer.io using a different Prefect flow. Then when customer.io, an event happens in customer.io where they say, we're ready to revive this lead, customer.io is going to call a webhook, since it's an event-based thing and not a batch-based thing. So the customer.io calls a webhook that hits the Sensomatic, and the Sensomatic pushes an event into a BigQuery table that a Prefect flow looks at in a batch fashion. And the Prefect flow loads those events and then pushes that information into Salesforce and changes the state of the Salesforce system. So I kind of paused for questions, but it seems like, yeah, all right. I think I'm just going to press on. So this is sort of the look at the system. And so in this way, we were hoping that we'd be able to push leads, sort of through this process and then have them come through and back many times, right? The way that we accomplished these Prefect flows and the coordination of them is by using this one Prefect flow. If any of you are familiar with Prefect Cloud, you might be familiar with this schematic view. It's not showing up very well on my slides. I apologize for that. But the most important thing to note here is essentially that we've got a couple of different flows up here at the top where we're gonna like run some initial transformations. We're gonna put like load things into BigQuery. We're gonna run our DBT models, and then afterwards we're gonna perform the syncs into our operational tools. So we have a couple of census syncs in here that sync information from our product into Salesforce, and we have a couple of other Prefect flows that do some analysis, like lead scoring, and push that information into Salesforce as well. So afterwards, we added a couple of steps, and this is the proposed flow V2, where in addition to what I described before, we were also going to coordinate the pulling of information out of Salesforce, and then making sure that we actually have to do it twice. We pull information out of Salesforce, we do all of our syncs through Census, and then where we push everything into customer.io, and then we actually pull everything down again to make sure that the whole circle makes it through on any given day. So this runs once every 24 hours at like 1 a.m. UTC. And this is sort of the basis for like most of our data operations here at Prefect from the analytics side. So at the point that this was in place, we tried a brief like MVP and everyone felt pretty good about it. So we pushed it into production. So I wish I could tell you that everything outlined came to pass flawlessly and that I'm a genius who will be taking over as the CTO of Prefect. However, we did run into one or two problems. So it turns out that translating state is a little bit more between systems can be a little bit more difficult than it seems on the surface. So we had thought a little bit about how to translate concepts between Customer.io and Salesforce, but we hadn't thought it through like sort of completely. And we weren't trying to introduce some sort of intermediate state store like a different Postgres database, right? Because of the principles I mentioned earlier, where we're trying to minimize the amount of infrastructure that we actually care for, right? So we ended up having to rework the way that state changes were working in the system, because on the first day that this ran, we were actually all at an in-person conference, and we accidentally generated 3,000 superfluous leads that went to Salesforce, which was not amazing because we get to watch in real time as the sales team's notifications blew up, and it was not great. So, but what we did is we identified the three different groups that exist sort of within Customer.io, because Customer.io doesn't think in terms of leads, it thinks in terms of people. And each of these groups of people were going to have different responsibilities from the perspective of the marketing team. So for example, these enterprise users that are already using our product are not eligible for this process at all because their accounts are closed. There's no need for us to be considering them for this lead process. Additionally, there's a very big difference between self-serve users for whom we don't have any open leads or we don't believe we're ready to reach out to, and these growth leads where we're certain that the marketing team should be handling them, and then the interchange between sending those growth leads from Customer.io into Salesforce. So once we established better patterns and better delineations between these groups, it was much easier for us to reason about the logic of who should own what and when, and everything went much more smoothly. So overall, what we ended up with was a system that looked exactly like I initially described, and leads, once we solved our problems with our state, all of the events and like email addresses and leads essentially began moving through the system in a very clean way. In terms of results, we don't actually have any idea because we finished this last week. But I will say that the growth team is very pleased with me. But seriously, this is a big improvement. It's really important to make sure that you're not sort of rejecting folks that aren't ready to talk to you when you first think you might want to talk to them. It's important to keep them around in your system and keep them sort of in the back of your mind so that when they might be ready for the help of your sales or your customer success team, that you have that context for them, and then they feel inclined and ready to come and talk to you. So hopefully that is what we achieved here. All right. So thank you very much for listening to me ramble, and I hope this was interesting. And we definitely have some time here for some questions.
All right, thanks, Dylan. So shamelessly, two of the questions that are in Q&A right now are mine. So if you are listening and have questions about data black holes, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, data orchestration, anything like that for Dylan, please drop them in. But otherwise, I can grill you about questions I had during your
Sure.
presentation. So when you were talking about like how you're basically rewarming leads that are falling out of your sales funnel, what are you or how are you thinking through the content scoring for that and like when folks are kind of warm enough to be handed back over to a rep?
So the cool thing about buying a tool that's meant to serve a specific purpose is that all of the logic that does that sort of scoring doesn't actually live anywhere outside of customer.io. So our marketing team themselves is able to set up whole like workflows in the tool itself where they say things like, if these 4 or 5 conditions are met, then perform this other action. And they can give attributes to each person and then trigger events based on changes in those attributes. So overall, the way that we're like scoring them based on content within customer.io essentially comes down to like the how many times and how often are they interacting with what kind of content. So if they're engaging with a ton of our beginner content, maybe that doesn't score as highly as folks that are engaging with like specific pieces of content that we believe to be like our core use cases. One of the examples is a ton of our clients use Prefect to run their DBT models. And so if a customer clicks on, for example, like a piece of content related to DBT, we might value that more highly than one that is related to, like I said, like the sort of the getting started questions.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. And I know you're only a week out from successfully being able to launch all of these improvements, so congrats on that. As you kind of think through communicating like the wins on these improvements to your various different stakeholders, like what are some of the communication models or reporting models that you're using to make sure that the work of your team is visible?
Yeah. So what's really cool is that we have a couple of different ways that we can showcase this, because all of the relevant information is available to each team in their own system. So because we have, for example, stats on the number of leads revived within a certain time period, it's our sales operations manager is going to be creating like reports on essentially the rate of revived leads and the number of revived leads that lead to closed deals. So that's like one of our key metrics. The other metric from the perspective of, for example, like the marketing team, is what content is driving the most of these reactivation events, and promoting and using that to decide where we're going to pour in like ad dollars and SEO money into like particular pieces of content.
Just very like proof is in the pudding kind of way of like they know it's successful because they're complaining to you all less as every day goes on.
So in terms of my personal look at it, so what we have done is we've created a dashboard based on all the information that we have from all of these systems in the data warehouse, and I'm taking a look at sort of like the throughput overall, where I'm saying like of the leads that were available for this program, how many of them went in, how many of them came out, and like at what pace. And so those are my 3 big metrics. But the folks that will be reporting on the success of this program are much more like the leadership and sort of the sales and the marketing sides. And so I'm the plumber essentially. So.
Well, great job with that, and also it's still good to know all the metrics and stuff, which sounds like you do. So thank you for sharing about that.
Absolutely.
Sweet. Well, I think it doesn't look like anybody else wants to grill you right now, but I will do the same plug that I've been doing all day. That Dylan is in the operational analytics community,
Well, I think we
and
got
we'll be hanging out. So yeah, if you have any other questions or anything like that, find him there after this talk or just in general. And otherwise, we will be back in a couple of minutes with a presentation from Irina. Oh, actually, right as I said that, Stephen drops a question in. If you're up for one more.
Yeah, certainly.
um,
Um,
yeah, can you say a bit more about the Sensomatic and what it does?
so the Sensomatic, the reason that it cropped up was essentially because in our user demographic, right? Um, it's something like 75% of our users use ad blockers. And so a sort of out of the box like Google Analytics, like send events here, doesn't always work out for us. So what we found is that uh, it was very simple. It wasn't easy, but it was very simple to set ourselves up using sort of a combination of a couple of different things, a generalized analytics endpoint. So essentially what it is it's an API endpoint that is a little Python web server, and its only job is to take events passed to it over HTTP and stream them into BigQuery. It doesn't have really opinions about what those events are or even where they should go or what they're relevant to. It just takes in the information and streams it. Um, it's run or it's hosted with Google Cloud Run, which is a service that I'm a huge fan of because it's a basically scale this container, stateless container as a service. You pass it a Docker container with your app in it and the command to run your app, and it takes that, sets up all of your networking concerns, gives you a public IP address or a public URL, and then manages horizontally scaling the service, and it only bills you for like CPU instance time. So if the thing is running and it's actually processing events, you get charged, but we get charged very little. Like I think our bill for this in Sabatic every month is like under $20. It's like one of our cheapest pieces of infrastructure. So despite its purpose, which is tons and tons of instances in the world sending events. So
Awesome. Thanks for taking a second to explain that some more. I appreciate it.
yeah, no worries.
Sweet. Well, last call for real on questions. I can jinx it and give you an outro again and see if people submit. But otherwise, yeah, please drop them into the community after this. And we appreciate it. Thanks so much for all your work on the presentation, joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.